dispute and it's in front of a competent judicial body, that person retains all their rights, including the rights to have any remedies stayed. What this does is it creates enforcement tools that don't exist now. It doesn't negate any existing rights. The hypothetical that the Assemblyman gave, again, we don't know if the property that he's talking about is, if the attorney's involved in the business of selling property, or if that's a property that the attorney's representing somebody on. I think the hypotheticals get really far afield. The fact is that this is a very narrow piece of legislation. It provides a tool the state doesn't have now. In terms of the filings that a professional or any other businessman may do for their corporation or for tax clearance certificates, this is going to require that outstanding taxes be paid. It's going to do nothing more than that.
Through the chair, Mr. Speaker, I believe Assemblyman Wisniewski already stated that business entity could be defined as a profession such as an attorney in Section 1 of the bill. Later on in the definitions on line 39 states state tax indebtedness to include any state tax. That could be income tax, that could be anything else. And I have to apologize through the chair to the sponsor. I haven't read this bill as thoroughly as I'd like to. Could you please show me that provision in the bill where you said that the attorney's license would not be jeopardized, that he would have a right to dispute that issue with the Division of Taxation and his license wouldn't be in jeopardy?
Well, Assemblyman, that's existing law. Through the Speaker, that's existing law. We're not changing existing law. We're creating a new tool for tax enforcement. So for someone to say, well, I don't see it in this bill, is being rather disingenuous, because this bill doesn't address every other existing law in the state of New Jersey. This bill addresses what we're changing today.
Through the chair, if we're not changing existing law and the State Division of Taxation already has this power, what is the purpose of this bill?
No. You didn't say the state already has the power under this. We're not changing any existing laws with regard to remedies that persons may have with disputes with the Division of Taxation. If you file a suit and you're challenging a claim, all of those rights that you have in making that challenge still exist. This simply provides a new enforcement tool.
Through the chair, Assemblyman, if you show me in the bill where that right is guaranteed in this bill, I'll sit down and stop my questioning.
Well, there is no bill that guarantees that right. That's existing law. I would suggest we walk down to the law library and we could start going through some precedents and case law, and we could find that for you. But there's no bill before this body today that deals with existing precedent and case law.
On the bill, Mr. Speaker, I respectfully disagree.
On the bill. Finish on the bill. Assemblyman Malone.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have a couple questions of the sponsor.
Will the sponsor yield?
Certainly.
Would this include cosmetologists?
Are they a profession? Do they have a license?
Yes,
do they do business in the state?
Yes,
Probably
they do.
might.
I'm just asking, do they include cosmetologists?
Well, in all honesty, Assemblyman, through the chair, there's no list of every profession included or not included. So if the cosmetologist falls into the definition of a business entity, then they would be included.
So this would also include, certified nurses' aides who have a certification under your definition of this term?
If they're organized as a business entity, any profession, any group, any person organized as a business entity would be included under this.
So theoretically, if a nursing home is licensed through an operator, we could shut down nursing homes, correct?
No, we're not going to shut down nursing homes. We're going to make sure that if there are taxes paid, there are taxes owed by a business entity, they pay their taxes. Well, I'm not sure, Mr. Speaker, what's so hard to understand about a piece of legislation that says if somebody owes taxes to the state of New Jersey and they haven't paid it, we're not going to give them the documents they're seeking from the state of New Jersey until they pay it. That's what this bill says.
To the Speaker, I guess I'm trying to look at some of the people that are involved in some of these occupations and or trades and or professions who may from time to time have some difficulties. shutting them down vis-a-vis potentially a nursing home. Now, if in fact the operator of a nursing home may be delinquent in some way in taxes, could they theoretically be shut down?
Well, I don't run the State Department that issues the licenses, so I'm not going to engage in a hypothetical as to what they may do. I don't believe that whether it is my party or your party that's involved in licensing, that anybody is going to go out and shut down a nursing home.
But theoretically, under this bill, this could happen, correct?
Could be the license of the owner. It could be the license of one of the people involved in the corporation. It could be a withholding of the renewal of their corporate certificate. It could be a variety of different remedies, Assemblyman.
Yes, through the Speaker. But you're giving a tool to the heavy hand of government that could potentially devastate senior citizens or other people in the community. And I just need some clarification that this bill will not allow that potential to happen. Given the calamities that we've had happen in some aspects of Health and Human Services here and DIFAS, do we need to potentially create that problem?
We don't need to create that problem, and Mr. Speaker, this bill doesn't create the problem.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, would this include plumbers?
Why don't we just start with the letter A and go through the entire alphabet of every profession? If they're organized as a business entity, Mr. Speaker, they're included.
Could it include teachers?
Mr. Speaker, this questioning becomes redundant. If somebody is set up as a business enterprise, they are potentially included. If they're employed in school district X as a teacher, we're talking about something else. And I think that the questioning goes a little far afield at that point in time.
I guess the only thing, through you, Mr. Speaker, the only thing that's redundant about these questions is the answer. I think that we're allowing the heavy hand of government here to make arbitrary decisions that could have significant negative consequences on individuals in the state of New Jersey. If we are so pleased, by the way, that all of the service agencies work with groups in the state of New Jersey, I would not have a problem, Mr. Speaker. But I think we have seen time and time again where misjudgment, misunderstanding, and mismanagement in areas that may have life-threatening situations for possibly a delinquent or a minor delinquency could potentially create public harm. And I think this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, should delineate exactly what the consequences are, who is involved in this piece of legislation, and what the potential harm is to the citizenry of the state of New Jersey. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Assemblyman Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question for the sponsor.
Will the sponsor yield?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'll yield for Assemblyman Wolf, certainly.
Assemblyman, according to the description of the bill, it's to enhance the tax collection process. Is that correct?
Yes.
Could you please explain part of the legislation that refers to the state tax clearance process that will be required? How does that work?
You're asking me how the tax clearance process works?
Yes, what exactly is that? Because that's what this bill says it will do. But how does that work?
The bill provides an additional tool for the Division of Taxation for state government in the tax clearance process.
Through the Speaker.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Assemblyman asked me a question, and I'm trying to answer his question, but I can't answer it if he continues to speak.
My question is, what is the tool? You keep referring to the tool. What is the tool that this provides?
The tool is that if you come to the state and say, I'd like to get my certificate of incorporation renewed, and you haven't paid your taxes, you're not going to get it.
The tool, therefore, is a question. Have you paid your state business tax? Is that correct?
The tool is not to issue the licenses or other documentation you may seek from the state of New Jersey if you have not paid those fees or other obligations that you're supposed to pay. You don't get what you're looking for unless you've paid the state what you're due.
Okay, one more question to the sponsor. Are carpenters included in this legislation?
If they're organized as a business entity,
Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Assemblyman Remnick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the bill,
On the bill.
it would be helpful, I believe, for the citizens in New Jersey to have one minor change incorporated in this bill. And that is on page 5, under subsection C. It says, notwithstanding any other law to the contrary, no person shall have a right to a hearing prior to the imposition of the suspension. So I would ask the sponsor to yield for one question.
Will the sponsor yield?
yes.
Mr. Sponsor, Assemblyman, we are going to consider passing a civil rights bill today, which would increase the opportunity, a democratic bill, increase the opportunity for persons to bring actions in order to promote their own civil rights. Here is an opportunity to put in a clause that allows a citizen of New Jersey to have an opportunity for a hearing to prevent what Assemblyman Corradimus, Assemblyman Wolf, Assemblyman Malone says, a potential mistake within the division, something that could clearly happen in today's bureaucracy. I believe, if anything, is a democratic bill. I would suspect that across the aisle, those who are maybe less privileged, who have small businesses, who don't have opportunities to have a lawyer, who may not receive a notice, at least give all of us an opportunity for a hearing outside of the complicated tax system. Because as this bill presently stands, the only opportunity is to challenge in the tax courts the imposition of the tax and the rescission of a license. An opportunity be heard. That's all I believe the Republican side asks. Thank you.
Thank you. Assemblyman Malone, the second time.
Yeah, just one follow-up question. Could the Assemblyman explain, through you, Mr. Speaker, what services that the state provides to a licensee that they are not paying for, that we will remove their license?
Assemblyman.
Business license, certificate of incorporation, those are services provided by the state. Those are privileges the state grants to these businesses. They're not going to pay their taxes. They're not going to be entitled to their privileges.
But through you, Mr. Speaker, aren't they paying a fee for that license or for that certification that provides or pays for the services that have been rendered to them?
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's a really great loophole, so that if you pay $25 for a license and you owe a couple of thousand in taxes, the $25 trumps all the money you owe the state of New Jersey. What this is trying to do is to correct that imbalance. As a matter of fact, this is a procedure that many municipalities engage in. Somebody comes in and they want to renew their liquor license. Municipality is going to make sure that their fees, their taxes, their water bills are all current before that license is renewed. It's only fair.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, doesn't the state of New Jersey already have adequate means to go after a small business person for tax delinquencies that they may have, rather than to deny them the ability to go to work?
Assemblyman.
Is that a question?
Yes.
Mr. Speaker, through you, nobody's being denied the ability to go to work. Nobody is being denied anything here, except those people who choose not to pay their taxes. This is a question of tax equity, a question of tax fairness. It's a matter of making sure that everybody who has an obligation to the state pays their fair share.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, just on the bill for a second.
On the bill.
I'm appalled because of the number and my own personal work experience in dealing with very small business owners, dealing with minority young men and women who are starting businesses in the cosmetology field and the small contractor field, for us to put this hammer over their head to have Big Brother government come down and slam them because they may be slightly in arrears on their taxes and take their ability to make a livelihood away from them, I think is shameful. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Madam Clerk, open the machine for a vote. All recorded who wish to be recorded. All recorded who wish to be recorded. Okay, Madam Clerk, close the machine, take a tally.
Mr. Speaker, Assembly Bill 3131 has received 45 votes in the affirmative, 31 votes in the negative, and no abstentions.
Assembly Bill 3131 having received 45 votes in the affirmative, 31 votes in the negative, and 1 abstention. I declare the bill passed. Let the bill take the usual course and pass bill. Bill on the clerk's desk.
On third reading and final passage, Assembly Bill number 3102, sponsored by Assemblyman Caraballo, changes the phase-out schedule of the Transitional Energy Facility Assessment Unit rate surcharges.
Assemblyman Caraballo.
Mr. Speaker, I move the bill.
Assemblyman Caraballo moves the bill. Madam Clerk, open the machine for a vote. All recorded who wish to be recorded. Properly recorded. All recorded who wish to be recorded. Properly recorded. Madam Clerk, close the machine and take a tally.
Mr. Speaker, Assembly Bill 3102 has received 46 votes in the affirmative, 32 votes in the negative, and 1 abstention.
Assembly Bill 3102 having received 46 votes in the affirmative, 32 votes in the negative, and 1 abstention. I declare the bill passed. Let the bill take the usual course and pass bill. Bill on the clerk's desk.
On third reading and final passage, Assembly Bill number 3103, sponsored by Assemblyman Wisniewski, transfers $110 million from State Disability Benefits Fund to General Fund.
Assemblyman Wisniewski.
Mr. Speaker, I move the bill.
Assemblyman Wisniewski moves the bill. Assemblyman Shakatakis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have questions for the sponsor. If he would
Will
be
the sponsor yield?
I will, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Speaker. What was the purpose of establishing the Disability Insurance Fund?
To provide temporary disability benefits.
Okay. What is the projected fund balance for this after our projected budget for 05 will be? Do you know?
The surplus balance would be $215 million for the current fiscal year.
Well, I'm not referring to this fiscal year, for the fiscal year 05.
Well, the projections for fiscal year 05, and I'm getting them right now, with this legislation in effect, the fund balance will be $140 million.
To you, Mr. Speaker, how much are we withdrawing from this fund for the general treasury?
Well, I think the question is how much from this fund is going into the general fund?
Yes.
$110 million.
Oh, thank you. Mr. Speaker, on the bill.
On the bill.
Rather than rating this fund every year for purposes other than it was intended for, we should reduce the rate and give the people who pay into this fund a break, both the employers and the employees. Continuing, and I know it's been done under both administrations, but we should stick with what this fund was intended for, and that was to help people who are temporarily disabled, can't work. And I believe I have conflicting information that this fund may have a negative balance by the end of the 05 fiscal year. Therefore, I can't support this measure. And I urge that we reduce the rates and stop increasing the rates on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Seeing no one further, Madam Clerk, open the machine for a vote. All recorded who wish to be recorded, properly recorded. Madam Clerk, close the machine and take a tally.
Mr. Speaker, Assembly Bill 3103 has received 46 votes in the affirmative, 32 votes in the negative, and 1 abstention.
Assembly Bill 3103 having received 46 votes in the affirmative, 32 votes in the negative, and 1 abstention, I declare the bill passed. Let the bill take the usual course of pass bills. Bill on the clerk's desk.
On third reading and final passage, Assembly Bill number 3104, sponsored by Assemblyman Dagnan and Bertuccelli, redirects $100 million in unemployment taxes to Health Care Subsidy Fund, changes thresholds for employers' unemployment taxes, and modifies UI benefits.
Assemblyman Dagnan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please move the bill.
Assemblyman Dagnan moves the bill. Madam Clerk, open the machine for a vote. All recorded who wish to be recorded, properly recorded. Madam Clerk, close the machine and take a tally.
Mr. Speaker, Assembly Bill 3104 has received 47 votes in the affirmative, 32 votes in the negative, and no abstentions.
Assembly Bill 3104 having received 47 votes in the affirmative, 32 votes in the negative, and no abstention, I declare the bill passed. Let the bill take the usual course of pass bills. Bill on the clerk's desk.
On third reading and final passage, Assembly Bill number 3106, sponsored by Assemblywoman Quigley, creates local tire management program, establishes a fee on new tire purchases.
Assemblyman Gibson.
Speaker, I have a question or two for the sponsor.
Oh, excuse me. Assemblyman Quigley, do you move the bill?
I move
Yes.
the bill, Mr. Speaker.
I apologize.
And then I will answer questions. I move the bill.
The tax, as I understand it, is on new tires. Does that also include new tires on a new car?
Yes, sir, it does.
Through the speaker. How about if the spare tire was one of those donuts, Assemblywoman?
Yes, I'm afraid it does.
Through the speaker. The money that will be appropriated for this new tax, what is the purpose of that will go?
Through the Speaker, there are 2 purposes for that. One is to collect and make sure that old tires are properly disposed of, that they're not left lying around being unsightly and dangerous to our communities. And the second is to clear the state's roads of snow when we have bad winters.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. What is the connection between the new tires and snow removal?
There must be a mechanism for paying for the snow removal, and there is probably no better group to pay for the snow removal on our state's roads than those of us who drive the state's roads.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Assemblywoman.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Assemblyman Panaccio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I may, briefly on the bill.
On the bill.
Thank you. There are already sales and use taxes on new cars, which include tires, last I saw. You already have sales and use tax on tires when you go in and you put a new set of tires on an older car. So in essence, what we're doing is we're taxing a product that's already been taxed. Well, how much more are we going to keep squeezing these taxpayers in the state of New Jersey?
Thank you, Assemblyman. Assemblyman Thompson.
Mr. Speaker, will the sponsor yield for questions?
Will the sponsor yield?
Yes, I will, Mr. Speaker.
To you, Mr. Speaker. You indicate that one of the purposes of this tax is to assure that old tires are properly disposed of. How will this assure of that, since the problem seems to be that people tend to throw them away somewhere or whatever? So how will it assure that they're properly disposed of?
The Department of Environmental Protection is going to develop that program. Certainly they are prepared to know the best way to dispose of these tires. One of the major concerns right now is the tires are left lying around our communities individually and in large clusters. They are, as you know, breeding grounds that no one knows better than you that they are breeding grounds for disease. So it is certainly important for us to get rid of them. And the Department of Environmental Protection will be charged with their disposition.
So they're going to somehow...
Through the speaker.
Through the speaker. They're going to somehow or other go around and collect the old tires that are laying around there?
No, through the speaker, they're going to provide grants to municipalities to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Assemblyman DeCroce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And through you, Mr. Speaker, can I ask a question of the sponsor?
Will the sponsor yield?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I don't know if I'm being repetitive or not, but is every tire on every brand new car in a showroom being taxed an additional $1.50?
Yes, so it will be a total of $7.50 when you buy a new car.
And let me ask you about these little vehicles, these three-wheeled vehicles that are in these different places. They're rough-road vehicles. They have new tires. Are they also tired at $1.50?
Let me think about that. It says cars. I'm not sure. Definition of motor vehicle includes any vehicle propelled otherwise than by muscular power, including trailers and semi-trailers or any other type of vehicle drawn by a motor vehicle. So yes, it would. But if they only have 3 wheels, they'll only pay for 3 tires.
Okay. So then you're saying that anything with a new wheel on it that's self-propelled there'll be an additional fee or tax of $1.50.
That's motor propelled.
Motor propelled.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Assemblyman Malone.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Just one brief follow-up to Assemblyman DeCroce.
Will Assemblywoman quickly yield?
Yes, I will, Mr. Speaker.
So this would include motorized lawn tractors?
We don't think so.
Well, is it... A lawn tractor
It's the vehicle's designed for use on public highways.
Mopeds, then I would assume, correct?
Through the speaker, may I ask the questioner a question? Are mopeds allowed on public highways?
As far as I know, they are. I've seen them. Maybe they are or aren't, but I've seen them on highways, and I've seen them on roadways.
Well, if they're legitimately allowed to be on highways, yes, those tires would count.
Farm equipment.
Farm equipment is not designed for use on public highways.
It does travel on public highways.
It does travel on public highways.
Are you saying it? So if I have a farmer who's asking me if his tires are taxable under this new tax, you're saying I can tell him no?
Not to the best of my knowledge, that they are not designed for use on public highways. They may be used on public highways, but the version of the bill that we have says designed for use on public highways. That would not include farm equipment.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Assemblyman Manso.
Mr. Speaker, I think
Would you rise?
Oh, yes. The folks who don't want to pay the tax on the tires can order the car without the tires and avoid all this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Assemblyman Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question for the sponsor?
Will the sponsor yield?
Yes, sir.
Assemblywoman, if the Brick Township Department of Public Works orders 3 new dump trucks, will they be paying for those tires on those dump trucks? Is the municipality required to pay for this?
If they have the proper documentation that they do not pay taxes on anything, they would not pay taxes on this as well.
Thank you. One other question for you, Madam Sponsor. Right across the line from what my district is Lakewood on Route 70.
I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker. I'm having difficulty hearing him. Thank you.
Adjacent to my district where I live is Lakewood, and in Lakewood on Route 70 is the largest Harley-Davidson dealership in South Jersey. Will we who represent Ocean County expect to have a call from all the Harley owners and potential purchasers, plus the owner of that dealership, because they will be covered under this law?
I heard the beginning of that.
Motorcycles.
Senator Doria, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sorry, Assemblyman. I heard you mention the Harley-Davidson dealership.
I said, will we as legislators be expecting calls from owners and potential purchasers of motorcycles from dealerships in our own districts because of this legislation?
If there are people buying vehicles at that Harley-Davidson dealership, they will be expected to pay the sales tax on the tires on those vehicles.
Thank you, Madam Sponsor.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Assemblyman Arcelina.
Mr. Speaker, may I ask the sponsor a question? Two questions.
Will the sponsor yield?
Yes, sir.
How about dirt bikes? You know, these big four-wheel bikes that roll around in the dirt?
They are not designed for use on public
Well, they
highways.
probably get there by driving on public.
But that's not their purpose. It may be the way they're used, but under the definition, they would not be required to pay the tax.
One other question, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, I was down in the men's room and I didn't hear all the debate.
We weren't looking for you.
Did
I assume you feel much
did I
better
hear
now.
correctly that, or do I understand that when you buy a new car, it has four wheels plus a small tire in the back? And,
Call it donut.
and you pay a tax on the whole car. Am I right?
You pay the tax on whatever tires are on or in that car.
Right. But now is this another tax on top of for the tires in the car in addition to the tax?
This is for the purpose of snow removal and disposition of old tires, yes.
So therefore, if I'm correct, there's double tax on those tires. When you buy the car as part of the tires are part of the car, you pay a tax on the whole car. And then you're going to be taxed also for the tires.
This is an additional $1.50 per tire to pay for snow removal and disposition of the tires.
Mr. Speaker, on the bill.
On the bill.
I think it's getting ridiculous to even live in New Jersey anymore. All these taxes. The other night I was pounded on all kind of taxes that we're going to have in New Jersey. Went to two social events. I've never been pounded as much as I have then. And I mean, this is a little tax, granted, and I'd give you $7.50 right now. But the thing is that I don't know where we're going.
On the new ethics bill, you can't do that. You got to.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I just think it's a ridiculous tax. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Speaker.
Assemblyman. Assemblyman DeCroce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One more question to the sponsor, if you will.
Sponsor yield.
Yes, sir.
Would you explain to me as to whether or not this would also apply to a commercial vehicle like pickup trucks, school buses, municipal vehicles, things like that?
It would apply to commercial vehicles, not to school buses, which are already exempt from tax.
Okay. But it would all municipal vehicles?
Yes, it would.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, this is an additional tax. On the bill, Mr. Speaker. This is an additional tax on the little guy who's trying to make it in life, the contractor that we're assessing some additional dollars. The fellow's looking to the state of New Jersey and has to be cleared for his license fees to make sure he's able to do different things. Now we're going to assess him even more money on the vehicles he may own with his little business. That's going to also curtail some of his efforts to be successful. Instead of being business friendly, this bill tends to be business unfriendly. I'm disappointed in this bill, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Assemblyman Malone.
Just one additional question of the sponsor, and maybe...
Will the sponsor yield?
Yes, sir.
I have the bill in front of me. Could you please point out where it's defined as only over-the-road vehicle tires? Just give me the under the definitions of the line.
On the page that I have, lines 15 and 16, designed for use on the public highways. So therefore, I'm exempting things like farm equipment, golf carts, which were not designed for use on public highways.
I don't see it on the bill I have before me, but okay. I must not have you. That's a committee substitute that you're reading from, correct? Okay.
It's the latest version, yes.
Okay. The copy I have is not the committee substitute. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you,
Well,
Assemblyman.
this is the one we're voting on.
Assemblyman Corey Davis,
Just have a question. The sponsor shall yield.
will the sponsor yield?
Yes, I will, Mr.
You've been
Speaker.
very patient and kind, and I appreciate that.
Can't hear you.
Said you've been very kind and patient. And I have a question. When a purchaser goes into a showroom to buy a car, there's usually a sticker on the window, shows all the itemization of the different components of the car, the options, et cetera. There's a bottom line price. Then there's, of course, the price you pay for the vehicle. And from the price that you pay for the vehicle, you pay a sales tax before you can get your car registered. I just wanted to know, is this a situation where you're going to pay two taxes now? And the reason I'm thinking about this is that some component of that car cost is tires. If you take an average price of $75 a tire, you're paying for $300 worth of tires on the car. You're paying one sales tax on that now. Is this an additional tax on top of the sales tax of the car tires?
Yes, it is. It's an additional fee, and it will be noted on the invoice that the buyer receives.
Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Assemblywoman McCose,
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a question for the sponsor, please.
will the sponsor yield?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, how do we currently pay for snow removal in New Jersey?
I'm sorry?
How do we currently pay for snow removal in New Jersey?
Right now, through the Speaker, we pay for snow removal out of the general fund, which means it's less money to be used for things like housing assistance and care for the poor, and so this will be money that will be dedicated to snow removal.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, do you know approximately how much we paid for snow removal last year?
No, I don't. It varies, of course, by winter and by weather. So it's not the same each year, and there is really no accurate way to predict what each year's cost will be.
Okay, again, through you, Mr. Speaker, I have a number of $30 million, and I was wondering how much is this going to raise in revenue for snow removal?
$10 million, which will help.
And the rest will come from the general fund? And is this constitutional, or in the Constitution that this... Are we constitutionally required to pay for snow removal?
No, I do not believe we are.
And where is the dedication of the tax, Mr. Speaker, through you?
I know I read it. I just have to find it. So through the Speaker, bear with me a minute. It is the last sentence, Assemblywoman, of Section 2. Additional revenue collected shall be available for appropriation to the Department of Transportation to support snow removal operations.
So again, I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, does that mean it will be constitutionally dedicated for snow removal?
We are not amending the Constitution, no.
So how do we know that this will be used for snow removal?
Through the Speaker, I believe the Assemblywoman and I have to trust what we say in the legislation that we enact.
Well, we get a lot of snow in Sussex County, so I'm not sure I'm feeling the love for this bill today. So thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. Assemblyman Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the sponsor yield for
Will the sponsor yield to question?
Yes, sir.
You want me to break, Assemblywoman? No?
That's good, all right. I was just thinking if I make comment that since Sussex County gets so much snow, they'll get so much more benefit from this bill.
Assemblyman Thompson.
In recent years, there have been a number of occasions where tire manufacturers had major recalls because they have found defects in the tires that they had put out. If a tire manufacturer has a recall, hundreds of thousands of tires perhaps in New Jersey that they are recalling and they are going to replace, will the individual whose tires are being replaced by the tire manufacturer have to pay this tax on his replacement tires he's getting?
No, sir, these are for retail purchase tires. So therefore, if the manufacturer or the wholesaler replaces the tires, the individual recipient of those tires would not be expected to pay a fee.
Of course, you still have the problem of the tires taken off.
Through the speaker, Assemblyman.
Through the speaker. You still have the problem the tires taken off would have to be disposed of. So,
it is my understanding, through the speaker, it is my understanding that in such cases, the dealer or the wholesaler takes the tires, and therefore it would be the dealer and the wholesaler with the responsibility to dispose of them properly, not the individual consumer's problem.
I would assume that as a follow-up to this, that perhaps we'll look at the cars again and we'll say, well, you know, we've got air emission problems and a great deal of this comes from automobiles, so maybe we'll put in a special tax on the carburetors of automobiles in order to help cover the air emissions. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Assemblyman Merck.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm awfully sorry, but I'm going to have to ask the Assemblywoman if she will yield one more time.
Assemblywoman, would you yield to questions?
Yes, of course I will.
Assemblywoman, through the Speaker, does this bill constitute an actual appropriation of the proceeds of this tax?
No, sir. This authorizes the collection of the tax. The appropriation will come later.
So the proceeds are just going to go into the general fund?
Let me check.
I'm going to hear the tire fund.
Wait a minute. What am I looking for? Oh, here it is. Sorry, I lost my place. The first $2.3 million collected in each fiscal year shall be deposited in the Tire Management and Cleanup Fund established pursuant to this bill. The additional revenue will go into the Department of Transportation for snow removal operations.
Thank you. Through the Speaker, didn't we just pass two bills out of this House, one that raided the Disability Fund, another that raided the Unemployment Insurance Fund, and would this bill in any way prevent a governor or anybody else from enacting legislation in the near future that might take this money and rededicate it elsewhere?
I don't see that this bill is different from any other actions undertaken by the legislature in that sense.
Through the Speaker, thank you very much. On the bill.
On the bill.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the sponsor's candor in acknowledging that this bill is the same as any other bill which sets up a so-called dedicated fund, but if it's not constitutionally dedicated, as we all know and as we've just witnessed within the last hour or so, it is possible to go into dedicated funds and to redirect them to other purposes. So in effect, this really is a general fund tax. And as a result, I don't think, despite the fact that the intentions may be the best, that we can vote for this with any kind of confidence that it's actually going to be used for snow removal, tire removal, or anything else. This is simply a tax. It's simply another situation where we're raising money for the state, and I'm sure the state will use the money as it sees fit, not necessarily as it's intended. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Seeing no one further, Madam Clerk, open the machine for a vote. All recorded or wish to be recorded? Properly recorded. Madam Clerk, close the machine, take a tally.
Mr. Speaker, Assembly Bill 3106 has received 43 votes in the affirmative, 36 votes in the negative, and no abstentions.
Assembly Bill 3106, having received 43 votes in the affirmative, 36 votes in the negative, and no abstentions, I declare the bill passed. Let the bill take the usual course of passed bills.
Bill on the clerk's desk.
On third reading and final passage, Assembly Bill number 3107, sponsored by Assemblyman Series, establishes 4-year registration period for new passenger automobiles.
Assemblyman Cryan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. On behalf of the Speaker, I move the bill.
Assemblyman Cryan moves the bill. Madam Clerk, open the machine and take a tally.
Which one's this one?
Are all recorded who wish to be recorded, properly recorded? Madam Clerk, close the machine and take a tally.
Madam Speaker, Assembly Bill 3107 has received 44 votes in the affirmative, 34 votes in the negative, and 1 abstention.
Assembly Bill 3107, having received 44 votes in the affirmative, 34 votes in the negative, and 1 abstention, I declare the bill passed. Let the bill take the usual course of passed bills. Bill on the clerk's desk.
On third reading and final passage, Assembly Bill number 3108, sponsored by Assemblyman Series and Roberts, the Cigarette Tax Securitization Act of 2004.
Majority Leader Roberts.
Madam Speaker, thank you. I move the bill.
Assemblyman Roberts moves the bill. Madam Clerk. I'm sorry, I didn't see the lights go on. Assemblyman O'Toole.
Thank you, Speaker. I have some questions for the sponsor.
Does the sponsor to you?
Certainly.
Assemblyman.
Through you, Madam Speaker, what is the purpose of this bill?
The purpose of the bill, I think Assemblyman described in the title, is to create a securitization fund.
And through you, Madam Speaker, what is the purpose of a securitization fund?
It is designed to earmark revenue that is in this year's budget and going forward for the purposes of allowing, in this case, the New Jersey EDA to issue bonds that are backed up by the revenue stream associated with this recurring revenue.
Through you, Madam Speaker, how did this idea come about?
Assemblyman, it wasn't my idea, and I can't speculate in terms of how it was developed, but I think, let me just note, it's not inconsistent with what we've done in the past with respect to the securitization of the tobacco bonds. It's something that I believe has been done in other states, so that may be the genesis of it.
Madam Speaker, through you, I'd ask if the sponsor could just walk me through the mechanics of the securitization. I'm trying to understand how this process works.
Okay.
Assemblyman, it might be most helpful if you ask specific questions, and I'll try my best to give you specific answers.
Through you, Madam Speaker, for the sponsor, if this bill passes and is signed into law, what is the next step? Do we have underwriters come in? Do we have a proposal? Are bonds sold? Is there an amount? I'm trying to understand how we move this process along.
Thank you very much. Through the Speaker, let me try and be as helpful as I can be. The bill will authorize New Jersey EDA to issue bonds. They will then go into the marketplace. They will get the appropriate professional advice. They will select an underwriter, and the bonds will be issued to provide the revenue that, as I said, will be backed up by the recurring revenue that is associated with the cigarette tax in the state.
Madam Speaker, through you, what is the total yield on these bonds, anticipated, plus or minus?
I believe it is about $1.1 billion.
Assemblyman, before you raise your next question, out of respect to the two members that are speaking, I'm going to ask the members if you would please respect and not go through and pass in front of the speaker. It makes it very distracting. So I'm going to please ask the members to respect the two that are standing, the questions that are being asked, and no member is to pass in front of them as we're trying to exchange the questions. I'm sorry, Assemblyman O'Toole, please.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I missed that last response.
Senator, what was the question again? I'll try and...
If you would please repeat your question.
Through you, Madam Speaker, what's the total anticipated yield on these bonds?
$1.1 billion approximately.
And through you, Madam Speaker, what will the yield be used for, if to your knowledge?
It will be used as part of the Appropriations Act that will be considered later this evening or tomorrow morning by this General Assembly and by the Senate.
Through you, Madam Speaker, is it fair to say that these proceeds will be used for the fiscal year 2005 appropriations?
I believe that is accurate.
Through you, Madam Speaker, what is the length of the maturity of the bonds? Is it a 20-year, a 30-year, a 40-year?
Senator, I think that is not yet defined. The New Jersey EDA is authorized to issue the bonds for a period of time up to but not exceeding 40 years. They will go into the marketplace and make a determination about the current climate when these bonds are sold. We'll look at interest rates and maturities and make that judgment. There is an authorization of up to 40 years. It may be 40 years. It may be a time frame less than 40 years.
Through you, Madam Speaker, is there a minimum term in terms of years? Is it between 20 and 40 years? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Assemblyman, there is no minimum term.
Now, in terms of let's assume it's 20 or 30 years, because we haven't really arrived at that. How are those bonds to be paid back per year? I'm trying to understand how we're going to generate revenue dedicated to pay off this securitization.
Assemblyman, I'm not an attorney nor am I a fiscal expert, but the way that I've tried to understand this, and it may be helpful and instructive, is that there is revenue that will be obtained on an annual and recurring basis from earmarking a portion of the cigarette tax that is collected, a portion of it that was authorized in last year's budget and what is being authorized in this year's budget. And that revenue stream will be dedicated for the purpose of paying the costs associated with this bond issue. In that sense, again, from a layman's perspective, it's not unlike a revenue bond, which has that identified source of repayment on a going forward basis.
And through you, Madam Speaker, is there a percentage of the cigarette tax that is set aside to pay these bonds going forward?
What is it? I'm sorry.
Repeat your question,
Sure.
please.
Is there a percentage of the cigarette tax that you've mentioned that will be set aside to pay these bonds going forward? Through you, Madam Speaker.
Through the Speaker. Assemblyman, I believe it's 30 cents of what was authorized in last year's budget and the 35 cents which is authorized in this year's budget.
Through you, Madam Speaker, we've heard testimony at the Budget Committee that there's been a steep decline in cigarette sales in New Jersey, particularly in South Jersey. And my concern and question to the sponsor, Madam Speaker, is if we continue to lose sales of cigarettes in New Jersey, will there become a point where we can no longer meet the payments of these bonds going forward?
Assemblyman, I don't have a crystal ball. I think that many of us who are concerned about the issues associated with smoking will hope that there will be diminishing use of tobacco products. But these revenue streams are dedicated based upon current use and what I believe to be reasonable projections.
Through you, Madam Speaker, with regard to this particular securitization, is there a set percentage of professional fees that will be generated?
Assemblyman, I'm sorry. Would you please repeat the question?
Sure. Through you, Madam Speaker, with this particular securitization, is there a percentage of fees or a dollar amount that will be earned by professionals working on this particular bond deal?
Assemblyman, that is not enumerated in the legislation. It's my understanding that New Jersey EDA will handle this issue in a manner consistent with other bond offerings, namely that those fees would be negotiated.
Through you, Madam Speaker, I have read with some great interest a concern about an opinion from OLS that is declared, at least one I've read, that potentially this type of securitization is unconstitutional. I'd be curious to how the Speaker or the sponsor would respond to that.
Assemblyman, as you know, I pay careful attention to OLS opinions, and I would note a couple of things that I think give me a comfort level, and I suggest should provide a comfort level to the members of the legislature as well. The first is that the OLS opinion acknowledges that their opinion is inconsistent with case law. I think that's on the first page of the opinion. They're proud and confident of the opinion that they've issued, but that they note that it is inconsistent with case law. And I would note as well that
The Attorney General has issued an opinion to the contrary. Bond counsel that has been consulted on this issue has also issued an opinion to the contrary.
Madam Speaker, through you, the Attorney General issued an opinion. Was that to the Treasurer, to this House? And do you have a copy of the opinion through you, Madam Speaker?
Assemblyman, I do. It's contained in a letter that was written dated June 22nd to the Treasurer, and I'll certainly make it available to you.
I would appreciate that. Thank you. Madam Speaker, I read some months ago that Moody's rating service had labeled this type of securitization as deficit financing. And I'd like to ask the sponsor if he would agree with that characterization.
I would not. I think, as I said before, I think this represents something which may be innovative. It's been used in other states. It's consistent with what we have done with respect to the securitization of the tobacco bonds. I think, and this may surprise you, I think it is fiscally prudent. Rather than incurring debt with uncertainty relative to how that debt's going to be paid, taking 65 cents of the predictable revenue stream that is yielded by the $2.40 per pack on cigarettes, and dedicating that revenue stream as the repayment for this debt, I think provides a measure of stability. I think, as I said before, Assemblyman, this is not unlike revenue bonds in that there is a dedicated source, identified source of money that is used for the repayment of this debt.
Madam Speaker, my last question for the sponsor. Does the sponsor think it's fiscally prudent to use bonding to cover operating expenses?
Assemblyman, I think it's from what the Attorney General has indicated, it's consistent with the prerogatives of this legislature relative to the Appropriations Act. And since we have identified a source of repayment, I think it is indeed fiscally prudent. I've been troubled in the past when this legislature, sometimes under Democratic administrations, sometimes under Republican administrations, has gone into debt with no definition or no comfort level with respect to how those funds were going to be repaid, simply with the expectation that we will find the money next year and the year after that and the year after that. I think it is very, very prudent to say that in exchange for receiving resources up front, we are identifying on an ongoing basis the manner in which the obligation is going to be repaid.
Madam Speaker, one follow-up question that sparked concern. We've talked about what the securitization will net in fiscal year 2005. And, Madam Speaker, the question I have for the sponsor is, if this is a bond maturing at 20 or 30 or 35 or 40 years, do we have an answer or a model as to what they will ultimately cost to pay these bonds off over 20 or 30 or 35 or 40 years?
Assemblyman, I do not. I think that I have a great deal of confidence in New Jersey EDA, their ability to gauge the marketplace and make sure that the bond offering is consistent with the best interest of our state. As I said before, they'll look at market conditions. They will look at the rate climate at the time that they are engaged in the offering. And they'll make the same determination that we would as a homeowner or as a borrower. That is a 15-year arrangement better than a 30-year arrangement. And I think given their track record, I'm very confident that they'll make the best possible judgment.
Madam Speaker, I have no more questions, but I do have some comments on the bill.
On the bill.
Thank you. And I certainly appreciate the sponsor's candidness and information with regard to this very novel concept. This bill, perhaps more than any other, gives me great pause. We have heard in the past, as the sponsor has alluded to, under Republican and Democrat governors, deficit financing and bonding. And we've heard this clarion call that we are just far too indebted in terms of bondedness. We have heard that we have to live within our means. And Madam Speaker, I don't think anyone could reasonably argue that bonding $1 billion for the Cigarette Securitization Act to pay for operating expenses for fiscal year 2005 is fiscally responsible. If these bonds are to be matured at 40 years, which we heard from the sponsor is certainly potential, in 2045, we will be paying off the last year of these bonds, and we will have nothing to show except operating expenses 4 decades earlier. That, to me, is irresponsible. Whether it's novel, whether it's cutting edge, to pay operating expenses 1 year and bond them over 10 years or 20 years or 30 years in private sector or public is irresponsible. I urge my colleagues to vote against this.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Assemblyman Munoz.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I have a question for the sponsor. Will you yield, please?
Would the sponsor yield?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Sponsor. Question is this. We're going to borrow money, I guess, today, and we're going to pay that back, say, 10 years from now, or 10 years from now we'll be paying that back based on cigarette sales or cigarette consumption or how many packs of cigarettes we sell in the state. Do I got that correct?
Substantially. Assemblyman, let me try and refine the point.
Yes.
We will be receiving resources now, roughly $1.1 billion, and we'll be earmarking 65 cents of the currently collected 35 cents, which is being authorized in this year's budget, and 30 cents, which was authorized last year, to provide the revenue stream for the repayment of that $1.1 billion. And I would note, as I alluded to in response to Assemblyman O'Toole's comment or question, that this 65 cents represents, if you will, 25% of the currently collected, or anticipated to be collected, $2.40 per pack.
So, through the Speaker, so that, say, 5 years from now, those same tax revenues will be used to pay off these bonds?
That's correct.
Okay. I'd like to speak on the bill, Madam Speaker.
On the bill.
I think we should use our sister community of New York City. They released an interesting report about a month and a half ago, and there's something called the price elasticity of demand. Price elasticity of demand basically says, let's say you charge $50 a pack for cigarettes, you'll notice that, a lot less cigarettes are sold. And what they actually showed in New York City is that, although they increased taxes 10%, consumption, or at least how much they had sold, had declined 10%, so it was becoming revenue neutral. So I think that we should take this as a potential fiscal policy of a real problem, say 4 or 5 years from now, if consumption or sales or something changes, and it is changing over time, we could find ourselves tens and tens of millions of dollars short. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Assemblyman Malone.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I just have a couple quick questions of the sponsor. Is it true that the proceeds for this bonding will be used to pay for the first 2 years of debt service?
That is correct.
Assemblyman, I would not, through you, Madam, I would not be asking any questions today if I could have gotten answers from the individuals who came from Treasury the other night. We asked some very basic questions, Assemblyman O'Toole and I. I have grave concern about this, but can you give us an estimate as to what the final cost may be for this borrowing?
Assemblyman, I cannot. That'll be driven by the interest rate at the time of issue and the length of maturity.
So we have no understanding or expertise as to what the potential cost of this bonding might be.
So let me be more precise. You asked if I could give you any assurance about the ultimate cost. The folks at EDA, who have a great deal of experience with these sorts of issues, they may have done calculations. I'm not aware of them. What I've represented to you in terms of the resources that are made available up front, as well as the revenue stream that's dedicated, that's the extent of my knowledge on it.
So, through you, Madam Chair, then the Assembly today is expected to vote on this bonding, not knowing in any way, shape, or form what it's going to cost over the term of the bond.
Assemblyman, I think that we have an element of certainty here, because we're dedicating 65 cents of our tobacco or cigarette tax revenue going forward. Obviously, that'll match up with respect to our obligation going forward. But as you know, these are not bonds in which the full faith and credit of the state of New Jersey is pledged. In the event that there's any shortfall, that's going to be borne by the people who are purchasing these bonds. They're assuming the risk.
Through you, Madam Speaker, do you know if these bonds are going to be insured?
There may be. I don't believe that's been determined yet.
That's all the questions. Just a comment on the bill, Madam Speaker.
On the bill.
I have spent a number of years in public life. I can never, ever remember as blatant a use of bonding to pay for day-to-day operations. I can assure you, I don't know if there's anybody here young enough that is in this assembly today that'll be around when these bonds are being paid off in 30 or 40 years. And I think for us to make this decision at this time to do this is really suspect, and I think it's going to have a tremendous pause in the bond markets. I think it's going to have a tremendous pause with the rating agencies that we are taking this quantum leap into the unknown as far as these types of bonds are concerned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Assemblyman Gregg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Just a couple of questions for the sponsor, if you might yield.
Would the sponsor yield?
Certainly. Through the Speaker, I think Assemblyman O'Toole was very good in getting to the root of the process of this bond, but I want to make sure I completely understand it. I think you stated through the Speaker that we're dedicating or using 65 cents of the cigarette tax to fund this bond. Was that correct? That is correct. And even though we have not done the cigarette tax bill, we have a bill forthcoming that will be providing 35 cents more. Is that correct? That is also correct, Assemblyman. So from that, I would have to determine that we are using 30 cents of previous cigarette taxes to fund this bond. Through the Speaker, I thought I said that a little earlier. I want to be clear for my own head on it. 30 cents, and I want you to be clear as well. 30 cents from last year and 35 cents from the action that is anticipated to be taken by this legislature. So in essence,
Gentlemen, if I may interrupt, we've maintained such a very nice, cordial back and forth dialogue. I'm going to ask that you continue to do that and maintain that same decorum and have it through the Speaker. So, if you would, please.
Through the Speaker, Majority Leader Roberts and I always have cordial conversations.
No, I meant we've been doing a really nice job here. Let's just continue that. Assemblyman.
I just wanted to be clear on those numbers for myself and then on the bill. I have a memory that when this bill was put forth, and really it ends up being two bills, one of which is to increase the tax on cigarettes and the other was to use the increase on the tax on cigarettes.
Assemblyman, I'm sorry, is this on the bill that
I'm on the bill.
Oh, okay, thank you.
I'm sorry.
Sat down.
I know. As fast as you could, through the Speaker. That these two bills were put together to, one, raise a revenue source, and then use that revenue source to borrow money through a bond to fund the budget for this year. And I remember quite clearly that the argument used to justify, if potentially there's any justification whatsoever, to borrow for operating expenses, which I think most of the folks on this side of the aisle agree that there is no argument for borrowing for operating expenses, and ultimately it probably would be decided at a higher level. But for today's discourse, that the argument that was made by the other side of the aisle was that if you bring to the table a new revenue source and it is completely dedicated for that purpose of borrowing for operating expenses, it made more sense by saying this is all brand new revenue. We're not using old revenue, we're using a new revenue source. And that was clearly the argument that was made. And now, a short few months later, we've determined that we are allowed to use old revenue to borrow for operating expenses. And I think it's a key point, because it really opens the barn door up clearly to say that any time we wish, with or without a new revenue source, we can borrow for operating expenses. And that is incredibly troubling to me. If we truly believed that that was a valid concept, we could have said the new 35 cents will be used for this, which I certainly don't agree with, and if it ever falls short, that the tax would automatically go up to cover it, and then perhaps the bond agency would buy into it. But this falls the other way. It says we will go deeply into existing revenue to
to continue to pay that bond. I think it's wrong, as my colleagues have said. And I think when you look at the machine and the process that's being used, you can see that it is wrong. And I think you can think or realize how wrong it is when you visualize a picture of a bond being borrowed today under the expectation of smokers paying it for the expectation that could go out to 40 years, that we are looking at a situation where a 19-year-old will be paying off this bond, and that 19-year-old will not have been born for 21 years. I don't think you have to think of a picture more ridiculous than that to wonder about the policy and process of what we're doing today. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Assemblyman Carroll.
Madam Speaker, through you, a few questions for the sponsor, if I may.
Would the sponsor yield?
Certainly, Madam Speaker.
Majority Leader, you've mentioned on a number of occasions that this particular tax is dedicated to the payment of these bonds.
I'm sorry, sir, I didn't hear the beginning of your question.
You've mentioned on a couple of occasions that this particular tax is dedicated to the repayment of these bonds. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Or is the repayment of the bonds limited to that tax revenue?
Yes, it is.
There's a bill limitation that says specifically that this House or the state may not pay back these bonds from any other source?
As I said earlier, there is not a full faith and credit pledge. The intent, and I believe it's specified in detail, is that the anticipated increase this year and last year's 30 cents are indicated as the revenue source for repayment.
So making the assumption that your wish comes true and 2 years from now, every smoker in the state of New Jersey quits, or at least stops buying cigarettes here where they're extorted big time and moves to Virginia to get them, this House would then be debarred from paying back those bonds?
I'm sorry, Assemblyman.
The question was, would this House be responsible for paying back the bonds?
Not would it be responsible for it, could it?
The state has the latitude to use its funds for any legal purpose.
So in other words, if this tax proves insufficient to pay off the bonds, the general revenues of this state will be used for that purpose.
Assemblyman, I think, I didn't say that at all. I think that there was a question earlier about the elasticity with respect to tobacco consumption, cigarette purchase. And I think we've seen that there has not been a great deterioration in cigarette purchases as we have raised the tax in the last number of years. So I think that there is a very, very strong likelihood that this revenue will be a dependable source to pay this in the future.
Humor me. Assume that it's not.
What? I'm sorry?
I said humor me. Assume that smokers are smarter than that and either quit or go to Pennsylvania to buy the cigarettes.
Assemblyman, as I said earlier, the state is under no obligation to provide revenue over and above the 65 cents in tax revenue that is earmarked. That is a risk that is taken by those who purchase the bonds.
Madam Speaker, through you, that may very well be. Is it a prohibition in the bill? In other words, are the repayments of these bonds limited specifically to these tax revenues, or can this state find itself in the position of being compelled to pay those bonds back with revenues from other sources?
The state has the ability to use its funds for any lawful purpose. These are the only revenues that are pledged for the repayment. This is a calculation that's made by those who purchase the bonds when they're issued.
Now let's assume hypothetically, Madam Speaker, through you.
Sam, if you could speak into your mic, I'm having a little trouble hearing you.
I don't doubt it. It's
Thank you very, very much.
Designed for someone somewhat shorter, I'm afraid. If this body were to decide today that Assemblywoman Quigley's tax were to be securitized, would there be anything that prohibited us from doing that?
There would not, to the best of my knowledge.
And so, Madam Speaker, through you, if this House had decided last week to prioritize the grossly misnamed millionaires tax, or to securitize that, would there be anything that barred that from happening?
Assemblyman, as I've said earlier, the securitization is the ability to define a predictable, reoccurring source of revenue and receive the resources up front based upon the pledge of that revenue. That would be open to any revenue source that the legislature chose to utilize.
So is it your position that the sole and exclusive prohibition contained in the New Jersey Constitution against borrowing without going to the voters relates to full faith and credit bonds?
Assemblyman, as I've said, there's an Attorney General's opinion which provides me a comfort level that this is absolutely appropriate.
So, Madam Speaker, through you again, your position then is, to reiterate, that there is essentially no limitation on what the state can borrow, provided that they do not pledge their full faith and credit.
Let me respond this way. I think that this is much more prudent, and this is much more defensible for us as elected officials to borrow this money, to receive these resources up front, and to pledge this money on an ongoing basis. It's a lot different and it's a lot more fiscally prudent than things that have been done in the past, let's say the pension bond refinancing, where the state received the revenue and then worried year after year after year without any thought to it what the source of repayment was going to be. Here we're saying that we're going to receive the revenue up front for the purposes of the outstanding projects that are funded in this year's budget. And we're going to make the same kind of a pledge that anyone ought to make to identify what the source of repayment is going to be. Rather than saying we will take the money up front and we will worry tomorrow and the year after that and the year after that what the source of repayment will be. This is much, much more appropriate and much more fiscally prudent.
Well, Madam Speaker, through you, I concur wholeheartedly in your analysis of the pension bonds as being fiscally idiotic. But the simple fact of the matter is that they were done. And now the question becomes one of what happens if our Supreme Court, having taken a remedial lesson in constitutionalism, declares this particular proposal unconstitutional? What then?
Assemblyman, I can't speculate on that. I'm not an attorney. I'm relying on the opinion that the Attorney General has issued, that this is a prudent course of action. I'm very, very comfortable with that.
Madam Speaker, on the bill briefly, if I may.
On the bill.
As I recollect last week, this body adopted a provision that will have a commission established to ascertain whether we should call a constitutional convention. In the past, we've also passed a proposal to actually call a constitutional convention. The query, why should we bother changing the Constitution when we don't bother reading the one that we've got? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Assemblyman Panaccio.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Just very briefly on the bill, if I may, I have the utmost of respect for the majority leader, except I couldn't disagree with him more when he calls this bill fiscally prudent, and the actions that the state is about to take fiscally prudent. If it's so fiscally prudent, if it's so good, why don't we just put the whole budget on a credit card? Why are we just stopping with under $2 billion? Because it's not fiscally prudent. We can identify other sources, other revenue streams. They're in the budget right now. We can bond for them right now. We could have bonded for them using this argument before, but we hadn't, and we shouldn't. I don't think it's fiscally prudent to bond for operating expenses. Between the bonding that we've been doing today, between this bill and the other bills, plus the previous securitizations, Madam Speaker, that's $5 billion. After 3 short years, $5 billion. And what do we have to show for it? Not a bridge, not a tunnel, not a road, not even a pen. Operating expenses, gone. $5 billion that could have been used maybe to allay property taxes, or to maybe increase some of those social services that we're so fond of, Madam Chairwoman. And if you think for once that the state is not going to be on the hook for these bonds, when you're allowing the Economic Development Authority...
Assemblyman?
Pardon me?
Please stay on this bill.
Well, the EDA is the source for the bonding underwriting, am I correct, Madam Chairwoman?
That's correct, but let's just stay on the bill.
But
I'm waiting for your next statement. Go right ahead.
The next statement is, we will never allow a state entity like the EDA to default on these bonds when and if the money does not come. And Madam Chairwoman, Speaker, I'm sorry, that money's not going to come. Trends show that people are smoking less and less. And we have seen the last couple of years with the other taxes that have been levied on cigarettes that people are going online and out of state to buy these cigarettes. People are a lot smarter than we give them credit for. It's not fiscally prudent, Madam Speaker. Rather, I think it's morally objectionable, to be quite frank, that we give our children the bill, not 20 years from now, but now I've heard it's over 40 years from now. So it may not even be our children. It could be our great-grandchildren that are going to be paying for the bills and the operating expenses that were occurring today. That's wrong. That's not fiscally prudent.
Thank you. Assemblyman Attalina.
Madam Speaker, I'd like to ask the sponsor a couple of questions.
Would the sponsor yield?
Certainly, Speaker.
Thank you.
Assemblyman?
You're talking about last year's 30-cent tax. I thought that was used up for something else. How can we use it for this?
Some of that was used in last year's budget, as were all the other revenue sources for the purposes of last year's budget. What this legislation is proposing is that 30 cents, together with the 35 cents that we will be authorizing later today, will be dedicated going forward, a total of 65 cents dedicated going forward for the purposes of servicing the debt associated with the $1.1 billion we will be receiving in this year's budget. So it's pledged going forward. It was used for as part of the general fund last year. The dedication is this year going forward, Assemblyman.
Through you, Madam Speaker. If I'm correct, EDA means Economic Development Authority to help businesses grow and bring revenue in the state. What does that have to do with backing these bonds? I'm getting confused.
Assemblyman, they have been the funding vehicle of choice in this state because of their extensive portfolio, their relationship with the financing community, and they're simply, if you forgive the term, they're being used as an instrument in order for this issue to go forward. They have the most experience and the best track record, and I think it's a good choice. Not unlike a county or municipal improvement authority that would issue debt for any public purpose.
Mr. Speaker, through you, I am a businessman. A lot of other people are businessmen. They'd love to borrow millions of dollars through DA and create jobs. We can't borrow through them kinds of money you're talking about, even a fraction of it. And I think, Madam Speaker, on the bill.
On the bill.
I think this is the most ridiculous piece of legislation. All due respect, the sponsor, I have a lot of respect for him, but I think this is the most ridiculous piece of legislation. It's going to take 40 years to pay off. This morning, before I came here, I spoke to kindergarten through fifth grade and their parents at a grammar school about the future of the young generation. And now I'm thinking back, looking at these children, if any of them smoke, they're going to be paying off these bonds until they're in their 60s, some of them 50s. And I think it's really a joke. We're supposed to be borrowing money to create jobs in this state, create more businesses. The governor's on TV all the time talking about jobs and jobs and jobs. I have a lot of respect for the governor also. But the thing is that we talk one way and act another way. And I think we've got to stop this nonsense. Legislation we've had here today, so much of it doesn't make sense. I don't want to go back and rehash, but I'm a businessman. I can't borrow that kind of money. If I tried to borrow money to pay my losses for last year, if I lost money, or the next couple of years, I was going to pay it back in 40 years, the bank would laugh at me. They might lend me money to pay a few years from now, see how I do, but cigarette smoking is a losing business. We're trying to get people to stop smoking. The more we soak the people for smoking, the taxes, and drive across the river here, the cigarette stores, go into Delaware, huge bargain. I live in Monmouth County by the ocean. People telling other people, go drive across to Delaware and pick up your cigarettes here, buy a big quantity, save a lot of money. It doesn't make sense. We're trying to get people to stop smoking, yet we want to tax for the next 40 years and pay off $1 billion in debt? No way. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Oh, Mr. Speaker. I didn't see you walked in while I was talking.
That's 2 sessions in a row now, Assemblyman. You're forgiven. Assemblyman Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the bill.
On the bill.
The sponsor indicates that this is different because we are putting a new dedicated revenue stream here to pay for these bonds that will be issued. It's been said that it may take up to 40 years to pay these off. People have spoken of future generations will be paying for these. But the reality of it is what we're doing today with this is we're spending money that is not ours. Thus, if we are enacting a cigarette tax today and anticipating this cigarette tax will be paying into the revenues for 40 years into the future, that money that comes in each of those 40 years does not belong to us. It belongs to those people that follow us, the future legislators. It will be paid for by our children, our grandchildren. And that money that comes in 20 years from now, that belongs to our children and our grandchildren. They should be the ones determining how to expend that money. Thus, we spend it today, we're spending it for, in essence, what amounts to our living expenses this year. It's not like we're taking this money and building some structure that 40 years from now, our children and our grandchildren will also be able to utilize. No, it's money we're using for our living expenses today. It's their money that we're trying to spend today that is totally wrong.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Assemblyman Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the bill, and then I have a question for the sponsor.
On the bill.
Mr. Speaker, during the tenure of us being in a minority and you being in a majority and the governor being the governor, last 3 years, we bonded more than $9.5 billion, which is basically 60% increase in the state debt. And this proposal, which we have before us now, has been questioned by Wall Street. They've questioned the bond proposal, and they've indicated that New Jersey is dangerously close to assuming the same debt limit as California. With California serving as a model, we can certainly be in a very difficult financial future ahead of us. And my question for the sponsor, Mr. Speaker, is that the first payment on this bond, I believe, will not be due for 2 years. Is that correct?
That is correct. I believe it's in fiscal year 07, Assemblyman.
Okay, and then it is not being on the Budget or the Appropriations Committee, I'm led to believe that the state is anticipating $800 million in unanticipated revenue in the coming fiscal year. Is that correct?
What you may be referring to, Assemblyman, through the Speaker, is an update that the Treasurer provided to the Budget Committee a month or two ago, indicating that some of the collections were running at a better rate than had been anticipated. He already indicated at that time that some other unanticipated obligations had eaten into the lion's share of that.
Okay, Mr. Leader, then my question would be, given the fact that unanticipated money is coming in, is it actually necessary for us to proceed with this vote? Because will not those revenues that we anticipate cover the expenses that we're looking at under the current budget?
Assemblyman, sadly they will not. As I tried to indicate, when the Treasurer told the Budget Committee about the growth in collections, he also indicated some additional responsibilities. Some of the court-mandated Abbott spending is one that comes to mind, but there were a number of others as well. But that growth in collections during the last number of months is anticipated in this budget, as are other expenditures, as is this as a source of revenue.
Okay, thank you very much.
Certainly.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Assemblyman Merck.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the bill, if I may.
On the bill.
Mr. Speaker, the sponsor previously indicated that from a legal viewpoint, bondholders of these securitized bonds are the ones who really run the risk of default. That may be legally correct. But I think our legislature has the obligation not just to look at the legal small print on the bonds, but also to look at the practical problems that would arise if ever a state agency, such as the Economic Development Authority, were to default on its bonds. We talked about this last year. The same issue still remains. If a major New Jersey state agency should ever default on its obligations to the public, I think everyone in this room knows that the legislature and the Treasury would have to ride to the rescue and would have to bail out those bonds. That's reality. And the reason for that is if we were not to do that, the creditworthiness of all New Jersey agencies would promptly go to junk bond status immediately. Everyone in this room knows that. And I dare say the people who hold these bonds are citizens of New Jersey, by and large. The reason they're citizens of New Jersey is because that's where you get the tax benefit. I do not think from a political viewpoint or from an ethical viewpoint the state of New Jersey could ever walk away from the fiscal obligations of an agency it created. Mr. Speaker, the EDA has no ability to levy taxes. It has no ability to cover these things if they go bad. There's only one body, Mr. Speaker, that has that power, and we're it. Mr. Speaker, I, for one, am very concerned about the revenue stream. We haven't talked about it much, but information that's come to my attention suggests that the revenue stream is eroding as we speak today. The sales revenue in New Jersey on cigarettes is down approximately 30% in 2 years. Why is it down? I think it's clearly down in reaction to actions that this legislature has previously taken, tax policies we have adopted, and as a result, that revenue stream is eroding. Are fewer people smoking in New Jersey? I think so, but I don't think it's 30% fewer. Revenues received by neighboring states, including Delaware and Pennsylvania, seem to be going up as our revenues from cigarettes are going down. I'm talking about volume sales. Consequently, I think it's fair to state, Mr. Speaker, that the revenue stream has eroded, is eroding, and if we pass the tax that's on the board in a few minutes, it's going to continue to erode. Mr. Speaker, we are spending income dollars we don't yet have. We are borrowing against the future. We are mortgaging our children's future to finance a lifestyle we would like to have today as a state. Mr. Speaker, that is not only inequitable, it is irresponsible, it is frankly immoral. And as my colleague Assemblyman Panaccio pointed out, once we cross the Rubicon, and by the way, I'll be the first one to say that irresponsible borrowing has been a bipartisan effort over the years, but once we cross the Rubicon of bonding for operating expenses, then, Mr. Speaker, there is no logical stopping point. No logical stopping point. Theoretically, it would not be necessary ever to really balance a budget again in the sense of having revenues equal expenditures. You just simply borrow however much you need to cover the current operating expenses. Mr. Speaker and my colleagues, that is a formula for financial disaster for the future of the state of New Jersey. Shame on us if we permit that to happen. This bill should go down. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Assemblyman Bremnick.
Thank you, all of you. Will the Majority Leader yield for a question?
Majority Leader, would you yield to a question?
Certainly, Mr.
This is
Speaker.
my first time asking the Majority Leader a question. I have had the pleasure for a year of watching you. Incredibly articulate, incredibly bright,
My question is, do you truly believe this is a way to fund the budget of the state of New Jersey?
Assemblyman, I do indeed, through the Speaker. As I indicated, I've been a critic sometimes in the past of the manner in which the state has borrowed money for one purpose or another, because it's created an element of uncertainty. And there was an analogy offered earlier about a credit card mentality. And I think a credit card mentality is when you go out at, let's say, Christmas time, and you buy everything you can possibly afford within your credit limit without any concern about how you're going to pay for it. And then January and February, March and April come and you realize that you can't afford what you purchased. That's irresponsible. And we've done that in the past under both Republican and Democratic administrations. Assemblyman, the reason that I think this is so prudent is that it's not unlike the notion of getting the present value for money. We are receiving the resources up front for the purposes, I think, very notable purposes in this budget. And we're dedicating an identifiable source of revenue going forward to repay it. There's predictability. That's good for the taxpayers of this state. That's good for the people who are going to buy the bonds because it gives them some measure of predictability as well. And just as was the case with the tobacco securitization, there's not a full faith and credit pledge. So the risk is being taken by the people who purchase the bonds. And I think that's a very desirable position for us to be in. Obviously, we're going forward in good faith, and I would just make one point I didn't make previously, and that is that Treasury has used a very conservative model, looking at some built-in declines in tobacco consumption going forward. Because even though none of us can predict the future, I think that one would conclude that 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now, it's reasonable that less people will be smoking than there are today. And they've got this conservative model that they've utilized, where we have the ability to get $1.19 billion for the purposes of this year's budget with this revenue stream identified and pledged going forward. With all due respect, I do think it is very, very prudent.
Through the Speaker, just one follow-up.
Sure.
Will the sponsor yield?
Certainly.
I've seen your passion on many bills. I don't feel your passion on this one. Though you've made a pretty good attempt on behalf of the administration, I commend you for your hard work. On the bill, Mr. Speaker.
On the bill.
I have watched repeatedly the commercial where the governor asks, what's new in New Jersey? What appears to be new is something that goes beyond voodoo economics to frightful and scary economics. And in conclusion, if I may say, I worry when I spend any money as a homeowner. I'm constantly concerned about my household budget. It seems to me that the state of New Jersey should be in a panic, should be having panic attacks like we do in our own houses when we spend money in this fashion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Assemblyman Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question for the sponsor.
Will the sponsor yield?
Certainly, Assemblyman.
Assemblyman, the bonds will be paid back in part by a 35-cent increase in the cigarette tax and a 30-cent increase from the previous increase in the cigarette tax. Is it established that the rate that would be established is greater than New York City?
Assemblyman, the total cigarette tax in the state, I don't know what it is relative to New York City. I must. I'm advised by the resident expert on cigarette taxation that New York City's tax would be higher than ours.
Okay, I didn't understand that, and I thought, Mr. Speaker, I thought that this increase of 35 cents, perhaps the difference between the original 45-cent increase and the current 35-cent keeps us under New York City. Perhaps that's the case. But it's getting so close, or it occurred to me that most of our commuters would buy their cigarettes in New York City, and we wouldn't have the revenue that we expected from this if that was the case. But you're sure we're still under New York City?
I'm getting a great deal of assistance, and I need all of it. I'm advised that New York City, with the state and city taxes together, would be $3. We would be at $2.40 total.
All right, thank you.
Certainly, thank you.
You talked a lot about risk. I assume that there'll be less risk if we dedicate more of our cigarette tax to paying back these bonds. Or should it be our incentive to have the lowest possible interest rates that we could on this and reduce the risk?
Indeed, it should, Assemblyman. And I think that, as I said, I think in response to Assemblyman Bramnick, that Treasury has used a model that is conservative. In other words, as they've looked at what is the expected maturity, or range of maturities, and as they've looked at what they expect to be the interest rate at the time of the offering, they have built in some decline in usage going forward. So I think that there is a real prudent calculation there.
Is the 30 cents from the last year's income tax, is that the total that this body raised last year, or is that less than the total?
I believe it was 55 cents last year, if I'm not mistaken.
So evidently, you or the experts must have figured that 25 cents of that 55 cents is needed for this year's budget, and the other 30 cents that we're dedicating toward repaying this bond is no longer needed for this year's budget. Is that a safe assumption?
I think the determination might have been a bit different. It was that if the goal is to generate roughly $1.1 billion for the purposes enumerated in this year's Appropriations Act, that a revenue stream going forward of 65 cents would be necessary to service the debt that would have, if you will, a present-day value of $1.1 billion.
And that the amount that we raised last year, other than that 30 cents, is needed for the budget, but the 30 cents is not needed for this year's budget. And
well, it's interesting. I should note this, because the issue takes effect in FY07, which is a couple of years from now. So both the anticipated 35-cent increase that we'll be voting on this evening, as well as what we did last year in its totality, all 55 cents, will be available for the next 2 years as part of the general fund.
Is there any reason, if in fact we should have an incentive to create less risks and a better interest rate, is there any reason why we shouldn't be pledging more of last year's 55 cents, more than the 30, toward repaying this? Is there any reason why we shouldn't do that?
As I said, I think Treasury, when they've looked at the models that I don't profess to understand, has come up with a fairly conservative calculation. There is a margin of error so that as consumption might decline over time, they believe that the 65 cents is adequate to meet the debt responsibilities. And I would note that they're going to go into the marketplace, and very sophisticated investors and financiers are going to make a judgment about what the model looks like and about the financial stability going forward. You know, and I think the marketplace in this sense will be the best evaluator of whether or not they've developed a repayment mechanism that's sound.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Mr. Speaker, on the bill.
On the bill.
This particular piece of legislation requires an increase of 35 cents in the cigarette tax, an increase that I'm not prepared to support. So accordingly, I will not be supporting this piece of legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Assemblyman Di Gaetano.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if this bill passes, the state will embark on a course of budgeting that it would not permit in any one of the 566 municipalities or 21 counties. The state of New Jersey reviews each and every one of those budgets and has not and will not permit what is really the amortization, bonding of operating expenses. And that's the direction this takes, Mr. Speaker. Much has been said in this debate about past bonding. In each case, during my 15-year tenure, the people of the state of New Jersey have gotten some tangible, long-term benefit. Either new school facilities, real buildings, known as real assets, land, open space preservation, known as real estate, again real assets, or in the case of the much maligned pension bonds, a pot of money, every penny of which was put into the pension funds themselves to be invested to yield return for every year in the future. But today we go down a different road. Today we are taking a tax that the state imposes. We have given it, this procedure, a misnomer called securitization. supposedly modeled it after the cigarette or the tobacco settlement securitization and argued that it's prudent practice. It is not, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I heard a very prominent Democrat financier opine during the tobacco settlement securitization argument that he thought it was an absolutely wonderful process to securitize that settlement. He questioned the use of the proceeds in just a couple of budgets for operating expenses, but he thought, and he was able to convince me, that the securitization of that settlement was good for the taxpayers of the state of New Jersey. What was not good is using the proceeds for operating expenses in just a couple of budgets. What is the difference between securitization and what we're doing today? There was a concern, a legitimate concern, that the settlement that was reached, which required tobacco companies to make these payments to the states involved, New Jersey being one, for many years to come, that some of these companies might not exist long enough to fulfill their total obligation. Thus, the term securitization was attached to that process. Why? For anyone who has taken Latin, the key portion of that word is the securitas, the security, the guarantee that you get the payment. So therefore, if you have the cash in hand in a fund, personally in your pocket, that is the security that you get paid. What you do with it then becomes your decision. So what are we doing today? If we pass this bill, we are saying that it is securitization, meaning that we want to guarantee that we get this money. We have seen time and time again how this legislature guarantees it gets proceeds from a certain tax. If the revenues don't come in from that tax sufficiently, the rates are increased. It has been done in the past two budgets, as a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker. But this isn't about securitization. It isn't about the guarantee that we get this money. It is about getting this money now so that we can use it in this budget, not for a real asset, not for a long-term benefit, not for something that the taxpayers of New Jersey, our children and grandchildren, 10 years from now or 20 years from now can be educated in or recreate on open space or have the benefit of the pension system, pension funds. It's not for that. It is for this year's operating expenses. The benefit will be gleaned in this year and this year only. It is not a long-term benefit. It is not a real asset. That is why the state would never permit any of the 566 municipalities or any of the 21 counties to operate in this fashion. But under this logic, Mr. Speaker, we are in fact increasing a tax, which the state has the right to do, this legislature has the right to do, and we are saying that we are dedicating that increased tax for the next several decades to this year's budget. By that logic, Mr. Speaker, I think we have to ask ourselves, could we take the billboard tax about to be imposed, amortize it for a few decades, and use the proceeds only in this budget? Could we take the energy tax, the tire tax, the phone tax, the realty transfer tax, the HMO tax, the spill tax, the toxic emissions tax, cosmetic surgery tax, outpatient care facility tax that we are about to increase or impose today? Could we take that tax for the next 4 decades, amortize it, dedicate it to the bonds, get the proceeds in this budget, and use them? I won't ask anyone to raise their hand who thinks that's a good idea. Mr. Speaker, This is not about securitization. This is about taking a 40-year benefit, a 40-year revenue source, and using it in one budget, and using it not to buy buildings for children to get educated in, not to buy open space to recreate on, not to have the benefit of a pension fund paying out year after year, but solely for the purpose of paying this year's expenses for the operation of state government. That is not prudent. I think the majority leader has done an excellent job of attempting to defend an indefensible bill, and I commend him for that. Having sat in his seat for 6 years, I know the burden that's placed on the individual. I say to the majority leader and you, Mr. Speaker, and every member of this House, any of the litany of taxes that I mentioned that we will enact today or increase today, ask yourselves if you think it would be prudent, whether or not you use the misnomer of securitization, would it be prudent to bond and literally take the next 40 years worth of that tax, 30, 20, whatever, and use it in this budget for salaries and wages, for goods purchased, consumables, this year and this year only? There's a good reason why when we review each of the state's 566 municipal budgets and the 21 county budgets, there's a reason we don't permit them to implement this same strategy, because it is not prudent for them. We know it. We don't allow them to do it. It is not prudent for us. We shouldn't be standing here saying to them, do as we say, but don't do as we do. This is bad practice, Mr. Speaker. This is breaking new ground, but I dare say it is not taking this state in a positive direction. Once again, it has taken a benefit of revenues for the next several decades and literally using them only for this year's budget. I cannot support this, Mr. Speaker. Past bonding may be debated. Some may approve, some may disapprove. This measure, again, a misnomer in securitization, but this bonding measure is completely indefensible. I cannot, with a straight face, go home and say to my children that this is providing for a positive future. This is giving them a benefit 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years from now. The people of this state will be paying for what we do with this money in this particular budget. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Assemblyman Malone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a few other questions of the sponsor.
Will the sponsor yield?
Certainly.
Is it true that this is not state debt?
Some of these will be notes that will be issued by New Jersey Economic Development Authority, and there will not be the full faith and credit pledge that would be the case with other debt issued by the state.
So the state has no obligation to pay this debt?
That is correct.
Could the state stop giving EDA the tax money from the cigarette tax?
They could. This relies upon an annual appropriation.
So if they decided to stop using the cigarette tax to fund the EDA for this purpose, who pays the bonds?
There is, as I said, there's not an obligation on the part of the state exclusive of this revenue. There is the possibility that these issues will be insured, and in that case, it would be the insurer's responsibility.
So if they're not insured, we could, in essence, walk away from these bonds.
That is correct.
With no effect on the full faith and credit and the rating of the state of New Jersey.
No, there is not a full faith and credit pledge. I couldn't speculate as to how the rating houses might look at an EDA issue that ultimately was not successful going forward. it may have some, it may tarnish the state's credit rating in some manner. I don't want to mislead you. I couldn't predict one outcome or the other in that regard.
So, through you, Mr. Speaker, if it is not an obligation to the state has no obligation to pay these bonds. If we decide to just walk away, why would it tarnish our ratings with the bond houses or the rating agencies?
I'm sorry. If you just,
if we have absolutely no obligation and they are not an obligation of the state of New Jersey, and it's just some entity that's a functionary of government, if we walk away from paying the EDA, you're telling me that this would have no negative impact on our bond ratings with the rating house?
I didn't say that at all. In fact, I said just to the contrary, that I can't speculate in that regard. What I've said to you is that those who purchase the bonds will make a determination about the willingness of the legislature to appropriate the cigarette revenue on an ongoing basis, the ability of the 65 cents to generate enough revenue on an ongoing basis to satisfy this obligation, and they'll look at that in the context of whether or not there's insurance as well, and they'll make a business determination about whether this is an investment that they want to become engaged in, as is the case with a whole host of debt that is issued by New Jersey and jurisdictions all throughout the nation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Madam Clerk, open the machine for a vote. Put Fred on. All recorded or wish to be recorded? Properly recorded. Madam Clerk, close the machine, take a tally.
Mr. Speaker, Assembly Bill 3108 has received 44 votes in the affirmative, 35 votes in the negative, and no abstentions.
Assembly Bill 3108, having received 44 votes in the affirmative, 35 votes in the negative, and no abstention, I declare the bill passed. Let the bill take the usual course of passed bills. Bill on the clerk's desk.
On third reading and final passage, Assembly Bill number 3109, sponsored by Assemblyman Cohen, the Motor Vehicle Surcharges Securitization Act of 2004.
Assemblyman Cohen.
Mr. Speaker, I move the bill.
Assemblyman Cohen moves the bill. Assemblyman O'Toole.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Through you, I have two questions of the sponsor.
Will the sponsor yield?
Certainly. Mr. Speaker, through you, a question for the sponsor is, what is the total yield of this bond?
I believe it's $720 million estimated.
Mr. Speaker, through you, to the sponsor, I've asked a series of questions of the Majority Leader, and I don't want to go through the entire series of questions. I asked, through you, Mr. Speaker, would you agree with those responses that the Majority Leader gave to me during my questions?
Through the Speaker, absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Seeing no one further, Madam Clerk, open the machine for a vote. All recorded or wish to be recorded? Properly recorded. Madam Clerk, close the machine and take a tally.
Mr. Speaker, Assembly Bill 3109 has received 43 votes in the affirmative, 36 votes in the negative, and no abstentions.
Assembly Bill 3109, having received 43 votes in the affirmative, 36 votes in the negative, and no abstention, I declare the bill passed. Let the bill take the usual course of passed bills. Bill on the clerk's desk. Hold on. Bill on the clerk's desk.
On third reading and final passage, Assembly Bill number 3114, sponsored by Assemblyman Barnes, establishes a merit rating plan surcharge for unsafe driving.
Assemblyman Barnes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Move the bill.
Assemblyman Barnes moves the bill. Assemblyman Bateman.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise in